Welcome to the Remedies video lecture series. This is lecture 8, and this lecture will discuss specific performance. Specific performance is just a form of an injunction that specifically relates to enforcing contracts. They have very similar requirements to an injunction, with a few added to address issues of contract law. The burden of proof in order to obtain specific performance in most jurisdictions is clear and convincing evidence. But in all instances, because this is a court of equity, the granting or denying of specific performance and the form of relief granted lies within the sound discretion of the court. Let's start looking at the requirements for specific performance. The first requirement is that there be no adequate remedy at law. The second requirement is that there is a valid enforceable contract, that it is definite enough to enforce, there's adequate consideration, and certainty of terms. We'll look at these later. In addition, the non-breaching party has either performed its obligations or is willing and able to perform. Likewise, the ability of the breaching party to perform. If the breaching party cannot perform, a court will not enter an injunction requiring specific performance. Finally, or in addition, not finally, in addition, there must be a mutuality of remedies. And now, finally, there will always be, because again, this is a court of equity, a balancing of the interests and hardships of the parties and of the court in deciding whether to grant specific performance and deciding what type of order to enter requiring specific performance. Let's take a look at each of these. Now, when we talk about inadequate remedy at law, now in the contract setting, it must be that damages cannot compensate the plaintiff for the breach of the contract. And here we're looking at a concept called economic interchangeability. That is, can damages replace what is being asked for? Can money, in essence, be exchanged instead of the performance that is being sought? This generally requires the court to look to objects or services that are unique, because if they're unique, then money cannot buy them in the marketplace. You can't use money to replace them. Now, a number of things are considered unique by the law. Land is almost in all instances considered unique, that no two pieces of property are considered to be the same, and therefore paying one damages instead of the property will not put them in the same position they would have been in. Other unique items obviously are heirlooms, pets, family treasures, these kinds of things. But they can also be property that cannot be partitioned or sold, personal services, or other goods and services that cannot be easily replicated in the marketplace will be considered to be unique, and therefore there will not be an adequate remedy at law, and specific performance may be granted. And you see this in some of the cases: the Hausman versus Dare case with the family pet, Henderson versus Fisher with real property. And look at Worcester Republican Printing with the television station, and how the plaintiffs go about demonstrating that one of thousands of television stations is still nonetheless unique in that context. Second, there must be a valid enforceable contract, definite enough to enforce. They're going to look at adequate consideration, they're going to look at certainty of terms, they're going to look at all of the aspects of contract law to determine if there is a valid and enforceable contract. And the validity of the contract is determined as of the date of making the contract, not later and not before the contract has been entered into, but only the date at which it was made. Was it on that date valid and enforceable? It will look at written or oral contracts. There is not limited to written contracts, and will consider oral contracts as well. The terms must be sufficiently definite. This obviously makes sense, so the court knows what to enforce. What is it going to require that is specifically performed? If the terms are so vague that the court will not know what to enforce, the court will not order specific performance. And again, you see this playing out in Henderson versus Fisher. Now, the non-breaching party has performed its obligations or is willing and able to perform. That is, and coupled with that, so these two go hand in glove, the ability of the breaching party to perform. So in essence, each of the parties must be able to perform their piece of the contract. And courts have the discretion, though, to determine the amount of performance that is required and to grant time for performance to be completed. So it again can look to what is reasonable under the circumstances as to how much performance will be required and how long it should take either of the parties to perform. And courts will often discuss and find that substantial performance is sufficient. Now again, what's going to be substantial performance is always hard to determine. But again, take a look at Worcester Republican Printing. In that case, the defendant could not fully perform because they didn't own one of the pieces of property that they had contracted to convey. And yet the court in that case finds substantial performance and orders specific performance. Now, the next thing to discuss is this concept of mutuality of remedies. That is, the contract must be subject to specific performance by both parties. And this arises in the context of personal service contracts, which are not often subject to specific performance. Courts have historically stated that they cannot compel a person to perform personal services. And in a contract that would require the performance of personal services, courts will find a lack of mutuality. That is, they cannot compel someone to perform a service in theatrical theater versus Roth, actors to perform on the stage. You often see it in other personal service settings, baseball players to perform, actors to perform, and whatever the personal services might be, courts will not require performance for a variety of reasons, including the 13th and 14th Amendments outlawing slavery and other policy reasons for not enforcing these. Having said that, there is an exception. The lack of mutuality can be cured in a number of instances. If at the time of bringing the action the plaintiff has fully or substantially performed or demonstrated that they will in the future perform, a court is going to find that they have met their piece of the contract. And mutuality of performance is determined as of the date the plaintiff is seeking performance. Look at the case of Henderson versus Fisher. That was a personal performance contract. The plaintiffs were required to do a number of things in performance of their duties. And because they had already started performing those duties, the court was not going to find a lack of mutuality in that instance. Now, mutuality of remedies, as I said, arises in personal service contracts. So if you cannot compel performance, how are you going to enforce personal service contracts? What the courts have stated over time is that you cannot compel performance, but you can compel non-performance. You can prevent someone from doing something. You can't compel them to do it, but you can compel them not to do it. And that's how we get covenants not to compete. They still require a uniqueness of the personal services. The covenants must be reasonable in terms of function, geographic scope, duration, and there is a strong public policy against them favoring competition. However, when they are reasonable, when the services are unique, courts will enforce them. Again, another good example of covenants not to compete are in Schubert Theoretical Company versus Raft. Take a look at that case and you can see how it plays out. Finally, because this is a court of equity, the court is going to balance the interest and hardships of the parties and of the public and of the court in entering and enforcing an order. So they will examine the equities of both sides to determine that specific performance will not cause greater harm than it would prevent. And they have the discretion, likewise, to mold a decree to achieve fairness through a balancing of potential hardships of the parties. That is, they can grant specific performance, but not give the plaintiff all that the plaintiff is seeking. They have the ability to mold and enter a judgment as they see fit. And again, you see this playing out, this balancing of interest in the estate of Lucille Osborne versus Kemp, where the court examines the interest of both sides, whether how much Kemp paid over the years, the fact that he lived in the place, versus the interest of Lucille Osborne and her estate in keeping the property. Read that case carefully to see how the court goes about balancing the interest, and several of the other cases in your book where the court does this. Finally, the court is also going to consider in this balancing the difficulty of enforcement. That is, the court has discretion in granting and in fashioning the decree. So they're going to look to see how difficult it will be to enforce this. So then, and courts have stated at times they will not enter an order of specific performance where the duty to enforce the decree continues over a long period of time and is difficult to supervise. But where enforcement is not difficult, they will balance the enforcement or the difficulty of enforcement against the inadequacy of damages, and in many instances will come out in favor of entering the order granting specific performance. And again, you see this playing out in Dover Shopping Center versus Cushman Sons. You see this balancing and difficulty of enforcement playing out. Now, let's take a look at a subset of specific performance. The UCC 2-716 provides for specific performance may be decreed where the goods are unique or in other proper circumstances. The comments to the UCC indicate that 216 was intended to bring a more liberal attitude toward granting specific performance than in the past common law cases in contracts for the sale of goods. And this is in part based on Articles 2's emphasis on commercial feasibility. This section introduces a new concept of uniqueness. It liberalizes uniqueness so that the court is not going to strictly look at products or goods that are solely one of a kind. So it doesn't just apply to goods that are already specific and ascertainable at the time of contracting. It's going to test uniqueness in terms of the total situation which characterizes the contract. It's going to take a look at the whole setting and determine if the goods are unique. And the comments go on to indicate that output and requirement contracts involving a particular peculiarly available source will fall within this concept of uniqueness. So is it commercially feasible to obtain a replacement? If the answer to that is yes, then it's not unique. So if one can go into the market and find a replacement without great difficulty, then it will be unique. And you see this again playing out in Sendak versus Charlie's Chevrolet. In that case, the court looks to whether the specific Corvette in question, the court finds that it was difficult to obtain a similar car. There was limited production. The demand for the product was great, and therefore the court determined that although there were 6,000 Corvettes made that were the same or similar, that this was an example of UCC uniqueness. In addition, the UCC doesn't limit granting specific performance only to uniqueness. It created this other category, other proper circumstances should be considered. And, you know, the inability to cover would seem to fall within this category. So this other proper circumstances opens up contract for goods specific performance in ways that were not seen previously in common law specific performance. So if the goods are unique, it will prevail. But other proper circumstances allows a court to tailor specific performance even in instances where the goods may not be completely unique or unique at all, but that fairness and justice would require specific performance. And, you know, so as I said previously, the inability to cover would seem to fall within this category. The inability to obtain a reasonable substitute without unnecessary burden, expense, or delay. So they're going to look at a far more wide-ranging review in deciding whether to grant specific performance. This concludes this short video session, and again, as always, you need to go to the TWEN site and fill out the video lecture assessment. Thank you.